Hello, and welcome to every single sci-fi film ever. I'm Aisha Khan. Before we get into this episode, I want to direct any newcomers to the full show notes, which can only be found on the website due to character limits everywhere else. So if you want the full detailed show notes, you head over to everyscififilm.com/watch, pick the episode you want the details on, scroll down, and the full show notes will be there. Secondly, if anyone is enjoying the series or the podcast and you have any friends who are really into science fiction films and history, please do recommend it and share. Now onto this episode. Today we're taking a bit of a break from the usual film fare to talk about a 19th century science fiction writer that most of you will not have heard of. I first learned about this writer when I spoke to Keith Williams, who was a guest on the Invisible Man episode of the podcast. And we ended up talking quite excitedly about Robert Duncan Milne. Milne was born in Scotland in 1844, but he made a reputation for himself as a journalist and a writer in San Francisco in the late 19th century. Today we'll be speaking to two academics who want to reinstate Milne as a pioneer of early science fiction. Keith Williams is a reader in English literature at the University of Dundee, where he also runs a science fiction programme. He has an interest in the pre-1945 period. Welcome back to the show, Keith. How are you doing?
I'm doing very well. Thank you so much for having me back. I obviously didn't disgrace myself too much the last time round.
Not at all. Joining Keith is Ari Bryn, who completed her master's at the University of Dundee and then began research on a PhD focusing on the life and work of Robert Duncan Milne. Welcome to the show, Ari. How are you?
Such a pleasure to be here. I'm excited for this conversation. I'm doing very well.
Thank you so much. Let's start with Keith. Can you tell us a bit about Milne and why his work was lost?
It's an extraordinary case, really. I've come across very few like it in literary history. His work almost literally slipped through the cracks in history in the sense that he was killed prematurely in an accident. I think we're going to talk about that in more detail later. And then the San Francisco earthquake, which followed on within a few years, destroyed the offices of the magazine that he mostly published with. So quite literally, his work sort of slipped through these seismic cracks, and a lot of it was destroyed by the fires that ravaged the city as a result of that. So it was never really collected together in his lifetime and has had to be reconstructed since.
Yeah, it's really interesting because I read about the San Francisco earthquake, which was from 1906. And although it lasted less than a minute, it ignited several fires around the city that burned for 3 days and destroyed nearly 500 city blocks, as well as killing thousands of people and leaving hundreds of thousands homeless. So you can see that it wasn't just a small earthquake, but how so much work could have been lost during that time. Ari, can you maybe try and describe what other writers Milne has been compared to?
Yes, well, we can't really say he's been compared to a lot of authors because people in the scholarly science fiction community aren't really aware of him. But usually people will want to ask him about him in the context of H.G. Wells, who he precedes, and Jules Verne, who he basically comes in the time between those two. So there are a lot of questions about whether he is the world's first full-time science fiction writer, where Verne was obviously a real novelist. He wrote some short fiction, but mostly like 54 novels. And a good number of these were speculative fiction involving scientific discovery or a new invention. And while he did a lot of research for each story, he was not a scientist, and often his science and inventions were less than sound. He wasn't trying to make real predictions about the future. So Milne was an engineer, a scientist in many ways, and so his science fiction is kind of infused with this scientific rigor that we haven't really seen. And he made his living writing science fiction. So that's sort of the difference here.
Okay. And can you tell us a bit about what kind of topics he was writing about?
Yeah, absolutely. He covered almost every modern subset of science fiction as we know it. We're talking time travel, dematerialization, teleportation, cryogenic preservation, things like drone warfare, molecular re-engineering of the body, personality exchange, the fourth dimension, remote surveillance. Keith can probably go on and talk about many, many more, but there's very few subsets of science fiction he did not write about in his fiction.
As Ari said, the list is sort of almost inexhaustible because it's so comprehensive. So things like alien life forms, the scientific resurrection of the dead, the rejuvenation of the body by all sorts of different artificial means, the scientizing of ghosts, which it seems to be a particular concern of Milne. He's kind of secularizing notions of immortality and the persistence of the spirit after death, in these various technological electromagnetic forms and so on. But these stories also tend to kind of overlap with predictions about, modern electronic media, because there's such an overlap in the 19th century between, sort of psychics and physics. And indeed, the familiar terms that we use for paranormal phenomena, from spiritualism, were actually coined off the back of telephony, telegraph, the theoretical possibility of television. So, terms like telepathy, telekinesis, teleportation, they're all related to those modern media. So the two things are kind of feeding in and out of each other, as they do in Milne's own, highly speculative scientization of the same themes.
Very interesting. Thank you. Let's go back a little bit to Milne's upbringing, because he was born in Scotland. Ari, can you tell us a bit about his childhood, where I believe he excelled quite a bit?
Yes, he was born in a town called Cooper, or near a town called Cooper in Scotland. And his father was a Episcopalian minister. So he was raised in a very religious environment, and he was sent to a variety of religious schools, actually a school that many ministers were sending their sons to. We can only assume that the idea was that Milne would follow his father's footsteps and join the church in some respects, but that was eventually not what happened. He was a great student. We know he studied classics, languages, had a very well-rounded and elite education, eventually went to Oxford, but at some point dropped out and left the university system, left the possibility of joining the church, and sort of vanished for a while.
But I just wanted to draw attention. I think you told me that he was head boy and he'd won like a range of awards and he could speak a lot of different languages. So like he was heading in the kind of, accomplished young man kind of direction. Yes. And then he just kind of left.
Ready to join British society, Scottish society, and vanished. So it is a very interesting story. Of course, we can pick up his story a little later, but there is a little mystery to exactly what happened there.
And do we really understand, or what are the theories as to why he just picked up and left?
Well, we can only assume that it was something, perhaps his lifelong addiction to alcohol, his alcoholism, that he becomes very, very well known, almost famous for in kind of late 19th century San Francisco history, had something to do with it.
There are also one or two speculative ideas about a possible family scandal. We know that his father was forced to resign his benefice by the elders of his parish. So there could have been something there that precipitated a rift within the family and, caused Milne to come off the rails. But I think the alcoholism, as Ari says, is a factor that sort of figures in Milne's whole life, and in a sense was responsible for his premature death as well.
And probably the the last theory is that he just was a very different thinker than those around him. He clearly had an interest in leaving society as he knew it, and whether that was at first to find work as basically a manual laborer for many, many years, or just envision a new world. And that's what California represented to quite a lot of intellectuals at that time, sort of a free-thinking environment for new ideas.
But he didn't go straight to San Francisco at this time, right?
There are, as Ari mentioned earlier, there are kind of lost years. We know that Milne went to he went to the West Coast, I think, to take up a job working for a corn factor that may have been arranged by an uncle of his who had business interests in the West. But then he sort of disappears. And we only know about a sort of gap in Milne's history between about what would be 1868 and 1874 when he when he finally arrives in San Francisco. We can only piece that back together from various autobiographical sketches that he published in the Argonaut and other papers, which kind of retell these extraordinary adventures that he seemed to have had, in what was literally the Wild West at that time.
He was held up by when he was alone herding sheep, all by himself, and he was actually visited by this band of robbers, and who were represented by this very, very infamous robber at the time named Tiburcio Vasquez. Yeah. And he didn't realize until later that he had served these men mutton and wine until he saw basically the picture in the paper. And so he was constantly almost being shot at. We have a story of him working on a hop farm or as a cook in these camps. So these are very exciting stories. So it's clear he had a very, very full and exciting life at that time.
Yeah, absolutely. It sort of reads like fiction in itself, really.
It does. And they're very amusing stories, yeah.
And also, these are his own tellings of these tales, so we don't exactly know how true they are either, right?
And he had a habit of fudging the details. He was always kind of changing where he was from and never really revealing very much in the way of autobiographical details. So it's very hard to piece together, truthfully, where he was.
I wanted to talk a bit about San Francisco in the late 19th century, because this is quite an exciting place. Ari, can you tell us, because you said it started to develop quite a kind of a cosmopolitan and literary scene, even though this is kind of the 1880s?
This would have been around the 1870s that Milne arrives, but for decades it had been building this reputation, with many writers of note at least visiting, if not making their home there, literary career there. Of course, famously, Mark Twain had already started to build his reputation in the West, including in San Francisco. And other writers that would pass through San Francisco in the 19th century, it's a long, long list. Of course, Robert Louis Stevenson, Oscar Wilde, Ambrose Bierce, who made his career there. So the list goes on and on. But San Francisco was sort of like this colonial frontier, right? In this sort of concept of the Wild West. So it was a very exciting idea. And sort of there was this mythology of the American frontier, right? And this sort of lax sense of physical reality, right? With the tall tale was helping to build that reputation for San Francisco in the Wild West. So writers kind of felt this sense of freedom in their writing. I think there was more of a license for absurdity and sort of freedom from rational explanation sometimes.
Very interesting. But before Milne started writing science fiction, he was a journalist. Is that right?
He was. He worked as publishing his stories of California and his travels.
And it would have been William Randolph Hearst that owned the San Francisco Examiner during that time, which is one of the papers he wrote for. And that's where you have found evidence of his excessive drinking.
Yes, that's right. Absolutely. We have a lot of evidence that Milne while we're going to get into his illustrious science fiction career, we have to mention the elephant in the room, which is that he was probably more famous during his day as the most notorious alcoholic and drunk in San Francisco at the time. We have a quote from many gossip columns from that time about just how intense this was. Right? I have a quote here. For 20 years, Milne has been engaged in a desperate attempt to drink up all the beer in California. So he thinks that beer, while adapted to his constitution, is generally injurious to the rest of mankind, and he is consumed with a desire to annihilate it. So that's one of dozens and dozens of articles that we find during this time that reference similar things. So he was eventually so notorious that William Randolph Hearst, as you mentioned, personally hired Milne to take this Keeley cure. It was one of the first rehabilitation centers in the West.
Yeah, so this was, he was sent off to try the bichloride of gold experiment, which was considered a cure for alcoholism.
Yes,
right?
That's right.
Keith, do you want to tell us a bit about his experience?
This resulted in a 2-page illustrated spread in the San Francisco Examiner, which would have been quite a lavish, piece of reportage at that time. And the bichloride of gold treatment was, allegedly a kind of cutting-edge scientific method of, sort of breaking addiction to alcoholism and to opiates and so forth. Milne underwent the cure and then wrote an account of it. In the account, he states that, his desire for alcohol had been cured, that the addiction had been broken, and then spectacularly relapsed about 2 weeks later, generating as much sensational copy as he did with, a report on this scientific experiment. But he maintained that this was a matter of willpower, that, even though he didn't crave alcohol, he nonetheless considered it, the most important pleasure in his life, and therefore wasn't prepared to kind of live without it.
In the San Francisco Examiner, on February the 11th, so a few weeks after he goes through this bichloride of gold treatment, it says, "Yet it is to be observed that the cure was physical only. Mr. Milne reported that he had none of the craving for stimulants, yet his mental attitude toward the drink habit was unchanged. He had gone to the institute with the idea that the life of the roisterer, which is a brilliant word, was preferable to any other, and associated the thought of pleasure in life with alcoholic gratification. He came away from Los Gatos with the idea unchanged." So, I don't know if they're doing that as a kind of a disclaimer, or if he just went in there and went, yeah, don't really need it, but I quite fancy a drink.
It was he basically referred to it time and time again as the only joy he got out of life. So I would not be surprised if he was not happy after his cure. Even if it really did work, he obviously, this was his choice. He said again and again, of course, whether it actually was or not is a whole different debate. But we don't really know if he had any sort of relationships or other extracurricular activities. So this was his choice of livelihood.
But it's interesting that Milne took part in an actual, inverted commas, scientific experiment, to do with the idea of, as it were, a kind of radical cure, a kind of regeneration of the body in some way, because that probably also feeds into some of his stories, which are also on kind of related themes of extraordinary scientific cures or regenerations or even resurrections in one case. However,
yes.
in his own personal experience, things were slightly less optimistic and positive. And we know that in that second decade of his writing career, that his productivity began to lapse, and his writing career stuttered, if not coming to a kind of an unfortunate decline.
I wanted to talk a bit about him as a journalist, because he starts writing for the San Francisco Examiner. Now, William Randolph Hearst did get accusations of what they called yellow journalism, which was sensationalism and exaggerating a story. And Ari, you were saying that when Robert Duncan Milne started writing, he did always kind of almost write in the first person, which would suggest that the things he was writing about were real.
Absolutely. This is basically Milne's style. And it's not really uncommon for fictional stories, especially of that time, to have this framing device, which is a first person account. This story is true. I witnessed it. But he took it to another level. In fact, you could call Milne possibly literature's first recurring journalist character in himself. So we've done a little research into this, but in his stories, he continually played on this. He was constantly even getting approached by new scientists, right? Who would say, hey, you're the one who wrote about that professor who showed you that amazing, basically two-way video chatting system, right? You want to see something else incredible? And he included doctored newspaper clippings, disclaimers, eyewitness accounts, and often for added credibility, he would even publish his works anonymously, saying that if word got out of that I published this, I would be ruined, right? I need to share with you this new invention that I just saw.
And then how do you know those anonymous bits of writing that you're finding are from Milne?
It's a really, really good question. Often he would eventually be revealed as the writer of the story, but often you can track his writings through recurring characters, recurring themes. His style is very, very clear and distinct. So it's often pretty easy to see. And also his stories also always follow this sort of format. Milne's narrator would encounter this gentleman inventor, or often a baron or a count of some kind, who is ready to demonstrate the latest technological breakthrough that he's discovered. So it's super convenient to him in a storytelling capacity. And he's always the skeptic, right? He's always kind of anticipating any possible question the reader might have. And he's the one who doesn't believe that it's true until he's finally convinced, wow, it's actually been invented. It's possible to dematerialize a person and send them through the telephone wires. I believe it now. I've seen it with my own eyes. So it's very recognizable style.
I just wanted to talk about something Keith mentioned when we had our discussion, which is the Great Moon Hoax of 1835, which was actually sold as a true piece of journalism. Keith, can you tell us a bit more about that, please?
Yes, gladly. This is the greatest fake news story, the biggest newspaper hoax of the 19th century. But it also creates a kind of precedent for the sort of documentary plausibility of science fiction itself, because at some level it is a piece of science fiction. In 1835, the New York Sun published a series of reports which were allegedly republished from the Edinburgh Journal of Science, purporting, as it were, to observe using a super telescope manipulated by Sir John Herschel, the real astronomer royal at that time, who was conveniently on the other side of the planet, so he couldn't deny any of this, purporting, as it were, to see close up the sort of flora and fauna of the moon, the life forms that inhabited the planet, including things like unicorns, intelligent beavers, and naked flying man-bats. So, to us, it's a bit like the Cottingley fairies, with Conan Doyle. It looks patently absurd, but I
love the way they knew that they were intelligent.
That's right. Well, they walked on their hind legs, smoked pipes, and lived in little cottages.
Oh, well.
So
pipes would do it, yeah.
Absolutely, that's right. So. It wasn't so much the absurdity of the life forms as the kind of plausible references to highly advanced telescope technology, sort of impossibly advanced telescope technology, and lots of scientific jargon and so on, and quotations from Herschel himself, which gave this pack of extraordinary fantasy a kind of plausibility that would in the context of the time have seemed highly realistic. So I think that Milne's eyewitness documentary style is a kind of descendant of that, and it's almost certain that Well, the moon hoax left a huge legacy worldwide. It became a kind of global sensation. So virtually anyone in the, many people, most literate people in the 19th century would have had some kind of memory of it. And Milne, as the son of a clergyman, who's growing up in a point in the 19th century where there's going to be this enormous clash between creationism and science, between, different cosmological worldviews, and their levels of kind of persuasiveness and plausibility. That's part of his background, and it's also, as it were, gives the moon hoax a kind of resonance in his work later on. And in actual fact, he writes his own kind of, I think there are two different multi-part stories which involve, observing other planets, using a kind of super telescope, which is very similar to the one that the moon hoax deploys.
Unfortunately, none of which are republished in our forthcoming anthology, which just goes to show how vast his body of work truly is.
Let's go on to his writing style, and a bit about his stories. Keith, you are quite Wellesian. Is that the right word? You're quite a fan of H.G. Wells. What kind of comparison do you think he has to H.G. Wells, if any?
I think there are lots of affinities with Wells. I don't think Wells knew Milne's work. I mean, some of it was republished in the UK, but not necessarily in publications that Wells would have been familiar with, because they were often regional newspapers in the north of England or South Wales and so on. However, Milne seems to anticipate quite a few of Wells's own themes, particularly the idea of technology for visual time travel. Some of his most striking stories are precisely visual time machines that enable you to kind of access images of the past and to kind of replay them, almost as if you were watching speeded up or reversed films. Stories like the paleoscopic camera and the idoloscope and so on. And Wells's own first science fiction novel, The Time Machine, also attracted a lot of attention from early filmmakers, specifically from a man called Robert William Poole, who approached Wells to file a kind of time machine simulator patent, that would have given people a kind of phantom ride into the future and back by being sort of immersed in moving image technology. That's the same year as The Time Machine, as it were, because that idea that Wells's book is also a kind of cinematic experience for the reader is something, again, which I think resonates with those earlier stories of Milne's. So the paleoscopic camera is, I think, 14 years before The Time Machine, and the idoloscope 5. But we also find a similar connection to early film technology itself. Robert William Poole was a rival to the Lumieres. He almost beat them to creating the first sort of cinema apparatus. Theirs was called the cinematograph. His was called the atrograph originally. But in New York, there was also a team of researchers led by someone who formerly worked for Edison and who essentially created Edison's film peep show, the kinetoscope. A man called W.K.L. Dixon and his team. And Dixon and his fellow inventors chose the title of Milne's second visual time traveling story, The Idoloscope, as the name for their own patent version of the cinematograph. So we've got an extraordinary coincidence there, in the same year as Wells publishes The Time Machine, but based on anticipations of cinema as a form of visual time travel that enables you to, replay the past or, reverse it or speed it up or whatever in the form of moving images, from certainly before Wells had actually published his novel.
Interesting. Thank you for that. Ari, you, I believe, have been transcribing many of Milne's stories. Can you tell us a bit about your experience of that and what you've enjoyed and which bits have stood out to you?
It's been such an interesting experience digging up these stories over the last 8 years. Of course, a small selection of Milne's stories was published in 1980 by science fiction historian Sam Moskowitz.
2 volumes, and the second one had the stories by Milne. Is that right?
Yes. The first one was sort of a biography, not just of Milne, but of the early San Francisco science fiction movement. This book has honestly been invaluable to Keith and I when starting our own research, to just showing us what to look for. He did basically provide not a comprehensive, but a very overarching description of dozens and dozens of Milne's stories. So we knew that they existed because he made reference to perhaps over 50 of them, but did not mention where exactly to find them. They were not really dug up. They were dug up and then reburied. Actually tracking this down ourselves has been sort of the challenge of these last 8 years, confirming these claims, finding the stories ourselves, and then transcribing them. And of course, we've done this with over 100 stories.
And so when you were transcribing them, do you have a favorite story, for example?
So many. Just the pleasure of discovering Milne's writing. He was so funny, so brilliant. It's so wonderful to be able to type out these words, because that's really what you have to do. And you almost feel the words kind of flowing through you. So
is it a lot? I know there must be so much about the current time, because he's saying, I went here and I met these people, but does he have a lot of kind of visions of the future as well? Or are they generally set in that kind of period of time?
One of the most amazing stories we discovered was how San Francisco looked in 1893 in archaeological fantasy. So what the story is basically a far future. It almost looks like a clipping from the future, from the far distant future, where in the future, these equatorial African archaeologists, which is in his imagined future, Africa has sort of been the leader of the world and has risen. Basically, it's a basically piece of Afrofuturism. And they find the site of old San Francisco where they believe it was, and they conduct an archaeological dig. And this is basically their findings, that what they found there. It's a brilliant piece of satire commenting on his current time, but using this far future lens where they don't really understand what they're seeing. They can't really fathom the idea of, for instance, a jail, or how the courthouse worked, or how the gym functioned. So it's a really, really funny and beautiful piece that we are publishing in our upcoming anthology. He also had visions of apocalypse, such as the Earth is destroyed by a comet flying into the sun. And he kind of goes through that whole speculative future, and even imagines a future utopia that could be born out of the kind of ruins of Earth. He imagines 100 years in the future, where basically elixir, this immortality elixir, has made everyone on Earth basically immortal, and explores the consequences of that, including the fact that the serum was made out of animals, and animals have been pushed to the brink of extinction in this speculative world.
Well, let's deal with his death before we go into his legacy. Quite a tragic accident, and maybe linked to his drinking. Is that right?
It seems quite likely. I think that Harry and I very much concur about that, because he was actually. It's very ironic that on the dawn of just before the dawn of the new century, the 20th century, that Milne played such a part in kind of reimagining, he has his own head-on encounter with electrical modernity. The very thing that he's most fascinated by. And this comes in the form of one of the new San Francisco electric streetcars on Market Street, a head-on collision with a vehicle that's only traveling in one direction, and where the motorman is sounding his gong to try and get you to go out of the way, to jump out of the way. It seems quite likely that Milne was, staggering around, slightly oblivious, and that this resulted in a fatal head injury. But I think there's also something very kind of symbolic about that in relation to his, to modernity, and also the century that he foresaw but didn't live to experience.
And Ari, you were saying that you think one of the reasons he is lost to history and all the events is because he didn't produce any novels or any kind of anthologies of his work.
Yes. This is something really common that we see in the science fiction canon and literature in general, where novels are sort of this key to immortality. That could be for many reasons. Either you're taken more seriously as a novelist, or it allows your work to be republished in any capacity. There is evidence that Milne was given sort of a monetary gift, that his uncle sent him some money in his last years in order to publish his books in order to publish his short stories into a book. But he never took that money and did anything with it. He probably drank it away, unfortunately, and almost consigned himself to obscurity until it's very, very difficult to dig these things up. I mean, it requires very passionate researchers and a lot of time and effort to do such. But we see this time and time again in science fiction, where these really incredible science fiction writers who only publish short stories are not getting the same recognition as their peers. One example is a Japanese science fiction author, Shinichi Hoshi, who's very, very not well known, but is one of the greatest writers of science fiction short stories that I've ever come across. Completely unknown in the US, partially because there's no novel. Even in Japan, his reputation is not very high. Other writers such as Cordwainer Smith in the US, there's several examples of this. So we see that not publishing a novel is basically the death sentence for a lot of these amazing writers.
Okay, so let's move on to the book that will be coming out, I believe in January, that you guys are behind. Can you tell us a bit about the book? And also, can we talk a bit about the price?
What is the price, Keith? It slips my mind.
It's an ungodly price.
It's rather
really
is. Ungodly is the the operative term, as it were. I think the economics, because it's in the Bloomsbury Critical Editions series, which is up to this point has been a rather scholarly, or aimed at at the scholarly market primarily, whereas we're looking to both tap into science fiction scholarship and also a popular reading audience. Because of the economics of that, I think Bloomsbury are waiting to see the interest that the launch of the book arouses before taking it into the hopefully a paperback edition, which should be a lot more affordable.
I would hope so, and I hope they're not judging the interest of that scholarly title based on how many people buy £100 or however much it is right now book.
Yeah, it is rather absurd, and we definitely had nothing to do with setting that price. If we could, I'm sure we would sell it for $25, right? In order to get it into the hands of as many people as possible. That's been our goal for the last 5 years, is basically making his works accessible. We have put on several even performances of a play that I wrote about his life and works in order to try to promulgate his works as much as possible. So our hope is that this is not the first time we are going to be able to publish his works.
And I believe you guys are going on an expedition to San Francisco to see if you can dig up some more information.
Yes, we're meeting there on a kind of field trip in a few weeks' time, and we'll be visiting places like the San Francisco Public Library, possibly the archives, but also having a look at some of the places where Milne's fiction is set. Because the other extraordinary thing about its documentary plausibility is that it's like a GPS system. You know exactly where you are. You sometimes even know exactly which building you're in, or which landmark the action is taking place around. And it's not surprising in a way that some of Milne's stories are about a kind of Google Earth-like technology that can sort of zoom in from space almost and sort of come down to street level and kind of track things moving around. And, they're extraordinarily self-reflexive in their kind of method and their theme in that way.
Yeah, and he wrote about San Francisco as somebody who knew it so intimately and as his chosen home. And he obviously loved it. And so we're hoping to maybe interest some local San Francisco historians or scholars in this work as well, so they can sort of join the Robert Duncan Milne team. And we usually find it's pretty easy to get people on board once they know about him. And so that's what we're hoping.
It is a very fascinating story.
We have a lot of collaborators.
Well, good luck with that. I will leave details of the book, which is out in January, in the show notes. And thank you so much for your time, both of you.
Thank you so much for having us.
Great. That's it for this episode. To find out what you need to keep an eye on for next episode, head on over to the show notes. And if you want to keep an eye on what I'm working on, you can head over to my Instagram account @EverySciFiFilm. If you have enjoyed the episode, please do leave a rating or review on your favourite podcasting app, as it really helps out the show. And I'll see you again next time. Bye-bye.